I just want to know, there's also been a slight surge in house prices. There has been in some areas a slight surge in house prices. Is that sustainable?
No. And why I'm saying this with a degree of confidence is that in real terms, as I've just said, house prices are still pretty high in South Africa. We haven't had the correction that, for instance, the Americans have had. So there's still a lot of downside potential for house prices in this country. I don't expect an implosion, but it will be a gradual decline in real terms. In other words, prices rising slower than the inflation rate.
Okay.
That's my best estimate for the coming few years. And the reason for that is, yes, on the one hand, prices are still pretty high. And on the other hand, as we've been discussing, the consumer is under huge pressure financially. And so it's a question of affordability.
Yes.
And I mean, one can tick off the various reasons why the consumer is under such huge pressure and why we tend to be pessimistic about the medium-term outlook for the consumer. And there are quite a few. I mean, they're still highly indebted, which you wouldn't expect.
I mean, we're looking at over-indebtedness of people and looking at 78% of disposable income being spent on debt.
Well, debt outstanding.
Outstanding debt, yes.
Yeah.
And that really
and that
is
is
an
very
indication
high
that
compared to, say, 20 years ago, when you would start an upswing phase in the business cycle when it was, say, 60 or 55 percent as a percentage of disposable income. So yes, we've got a serious debt problem, and on top of that, the prospects for job creation are pretty
bleak.
Bleak is the word, yeah.
Okay. So what are the prospects for the markets, taking all of this into account? What are the prospects for the residential and the commercial markets, in your opinion?
Well, on top of all the structural problems that the country is facing at the moment, you know, we think of the twin deficit that South Africa has to contend with. And on top of all that, we are in a rising interest rate cycle. Now, everybody swears on the Bible that it's not going to be a very sharp rise in interest rates. You know, the most pessimistic view I've seen is another 200 basis points, in other words, 2 percentage points from the current.
From now till when?
Over, say, the next 2 years.
The next 2 years.
That seems to be consensus out there. 150 to 200 basis points.
Yes.
1.5 to 2 percentage.
2%, yes.
Percentage points, yeah. But you know, coming from a low base, percentage-wise, that is quite an increase, and that's obviously not good for consumption. It's not good for house prices. It's not good for affordability. On top of all the other things like the rand that is vulnerable, and with it inflation.
Do you think that we could be looking at more than 2% over the next 2 years?
Well, nobody can say. You know, my view wouldn't count for anything. It's all possible, of course. You know, it's a question of probability, and the consensus is out there. Not that I would rely too much on consensus opinions of economists. Excuse my cynicism, you know, but it is possible. Look, I mean, our twin deficit is probably, you know, the electricity problems, water problems coming. You can't believe it, the problems
so what
we are
would
facing.
you suggest buyers do? Should they wait? Should they buy? What would you suggest a prospective buyer do?
Well, you must differentiate between houses and non-residential.
Yes.
When it comes to housing, I'm on record as having said for many years now, it's better purely from a financial point of view to rent at the moment. And I can show you the figures, there's no doubt about it. Assuming, and that's the important assumption I'm making, assuming that house prices will only rise at, say, half the inflation rate over the next 5 years or so.
Yes.
You know, then there's no doubt about it, because you're not going to get the capital appreciation. Therefore, from a purely financial point of view, it's better to rent for the next few years, especially if you're a first-time buyer or you're moving from one city to another. Rather rent and save the difference. That's, of course, the crucial thing.
Yes.
Save the difference. But if you're not going to save the difference, you might as well throw your money.
It doesn't help that you're renting and you're not saving to buy.
Exactly. Yeah. And that, of course, is the strong argument in favor of owning your own house, even if you have to do it with a mortgage bond, is that it's a forced way of saving. It's not
Yes.
necessarily a good way of saving, but it is a way of saving, you know. So that is the residential market. As for the non-residential market, one thing about South Africa, our non-residential market is not overpriced at all. It's very sound, and so if you can buy a good, a well-located property at the moment at a market rental, at a market value, by
Go
all
for
means, go for it. You know, as a generalization, especially if it's A and B. I wouldn't go for grade C,
Yeah.
you know, secondary stuff,
Yes.
prime stuff, because you'll find it's the secondary stuff that gets hit worse during a recession.
Yes.